Hello students, welcome to today's lecture. In this class, we will be talking about a different parameter which is called flow of water through soils. Okay, so we will be talking about how the flow will be getting initiated in different types of soils and what are the various expressions which are involved in deriving the flow of water through soils. Now what actually happens here is in any type of soils, we know that there are certain amount of voids will be present, and due to the presence of voids, the water will go and accumulate in the void spaces. Now these void spaces which are getting accumulated with water will create an impact both in a positive way as well as in a negative way on the structure of the soil as well as the various properties of the soil. Now this water which is getting flowed from the pore spaces to the outside of a soil sample is called as flow of water through soil. Now what exactly happens here is the water from one end of the soil sample will flow to the another end of the soil sample. Now why it is taking place? It is because the presence of voids or the presence of pores in the soil sample will be getting influenced by the action of water which is getting flown through these 8 spaces. Now you may ask a question that do we have any impact on the properties of the soil as well as on the structures which are getting constructed on this kind of porous soils or on this kind of soils where water will be flown? It is quite obvious that the water which is getting flowed through different types of soils will have a negative impact on structure of the soil as well as on the general structural constructions. Now because of this negative impact on the soil, it is very important to identify the permeable capacity of the soil. So or the permeability nature of the soil. So we will be discussing about permeability in the next class, but in this class we will be concentrating more on how actually the flow of water will take place between soils. So the reason why it is important to study is, the primary reason is it defines the rate at which water will flow in the soil spaces or in the voids which are available in a soil sample. So it is also very important to study the speed of the water which is getting flown from one end of the soil sample to the other end of the soil sample. If the speed or if the rate of flowing of water is at a very fast, then it is said that more number of voids are present in the soil. So if more number of voids are available in a soil, such kind of soil sample or such kind of sites must be compacted before we go for the construction activities. So this is the first case. Second case is we need to identify the compressive strength of a soil, which we generally call it as safe bearing capacity of a soil, which is also known as SBC, safe bearing capacity of the soil. So in order to define the compressive strength of any soil, these pores or the water which is available in the soil will also play a huge role in declining the amount of compressive force. The other important aspect is to know the strength of the soil. It is well known that all the soils doesn't possess equal amount of strength, right? Some kind of soils will possess highest possible strength and some kind of soils will possess very less possible strength. So for that you can take prime example as red soil will possess highest possible strength, whereas the sandy soil or the silty soil doesn't have much strength when compared to the red soil. Right? Because of these 3 reasons, we will be studying the impact of flow of water in soil. And along with this, as I said earlier, the different types of soils will have different types of porosity nature. And due to these different types of pores which are available in various types of soil, they get influenced by the action of water which is getting flowed. Okay, so we will be studying about all these parameters in the forthcoming slides. Now the next important thing which we will be talking about is Darcys law. So what exactly here is, he found out a relationship between the velocity of the water or velocity of flow. Right? So before we begin the Darcy experiment, I would like to introduce that Darcy is the name of a scientist who found or who studied the flow of water through soil. Okay, so he was the one who first initiated how actually the water flow will takes place in a soil sample or in a soil strata. Now if you take here, there is a soil sample at the underneath, and above the soil sample there were two piezometers which were kept, or two manometers which were kept. So because of the presence of these two tubes which are available on the top layer of the soil sample, when water is getting flown from one end to the other end, the same amount of water which is getting flown from the first end may not be there at the second end. Say for example, you have made sure that 10 liters of water is allowed to pass from the first end. The same 10 liters of water may not be collected at the other end of the soil sample. It is because some amount of water will get attracted by the soil particles, and some amount of water may not get attracted to the soil particles, and hence flow will take place from one end to the other end. That is why if you check down, there are two tubes which are present. At the first end, the level of water in the tube is high when you compare to the level of water in the second tube, and that difference is what he found out. Okay, so Darcy made sure that the flow of water at the starting stage of the soil sample will not be equal to the flow of water at the end stage of a soil sample. And also he found that there is a relationship between the flow velocity and the hydraulic gradient. The flow velocity is defined with the symbol small v, and the hydraulic gradient is defined with the symbol small I. So we'll talk about what is flow velocity and what is hydraulic gradient. So flow velocity is also called as discharge velocity. Now what is this discharge velocity or flow velocity? It is the amount of velocity that is required to discharge certain amount of water from the starting end to the end point. Okay, so this is the amount, the flow velocity or the discharge velocity is the amount of velocity that is required for the water to flow from the first point to the last point. And he also ensured, that is the Darcy also ensured that the rate of flow is the total volume of water that is flowing per unit time. So rate of flow is the total volume of water that is flowing per unit time. This is how you can define the flow velocity or discharge velocity. Now the second thing is hydraulic gradient. So you all know that hydraulic gradient I equals to h by L, where h is the height and L is the length. Now here what we exactly talk is, if you take a tube or if you take a water passing tube and if you insert two manometers or two piezometers, the level of water in the first tube will not be equal to the level of water in the second tube, as you can see here. So the level of water in the first tube is little high when you compare to the level of water in the second tube, whereas the level of water in the second tube is little high than the level of water in the third tube. So what exactly hydraulic gradient or hydraulic gradient line is? The line which is joining the highest possible points in each piezometer is called as hydraulic gradient line. See, you can observe a line which is joined or which has joined the highest possible level of water in all the three piezometers. So that line joining point which is joining the highest possible points in all the piezometers is called as hydraulic gradient line, and this hydraulic gradient line is denoted with small I, which is h by L. Okay. Next we'll talk about how actually Darcy conducted this experiment. So we all know that for laminar flow, right, you know there are two different types of flows. One is laminar flow and turbulent flow. Laminar flow is a type of flow where you can find that the water passing or the water flowing will be at a initial rate, like in a very straight direction. Whereas the turbulent flow is such a way that the path of the water will not be in a definite way. Right? Here the water will get changed, the flow of the water or the path of the water will get changed. So you can see, as you can see here, in the first tap, the water is flowing continuously in a single path, that is called as laminar flow. Whereas in the second tap, the water is flowing here, but the problem is the water is not flowing in a straight way, it is flowing in a zigzag way. So such kind of flow is called as turbulent flow. Now what happens? We all know that velocity V equals to K times of I. So what actually happens here is the velocity of the flow doesn't meet the requirements of the permeability and hydraulic gradient. So here K is the coefficient of permeability and I is the hydraulic gradient. Okay, so we know that velocity V equals to K into I, where K is coefficient of permeability and I is the hydraulic gradient. Now this is the Darcys experiment. So here comes the real scenario. So if you observe here, the Darcy conducted experiment in this way that you need to understand the experimental setup initially. So here he has got a soil sample at the mid portion, and above the soil sample he connected a tube, and beneath the soil sample he again connected a tube, and he found that how much amount of water is flowing from the top end to the bottom end, and what is the height of water that is getting raised in each and every tube that is jointed at the top and the bottom end, and that height difference he noted down. Now how he did the experiment. In the initial case, he made the water to flow from the top end of the soil sample to the bottom end of the soil sample. Then he found out the results of H1 and H2, which are height of water that is raised before it reaching the soil sample and height of water after reaching through the soil sample. So that is called H1 and H2. And he found out the discharge value, which is given as Q equals to KIA, where Q is called as discharge, K is coefficient of permeability, and I is hydraulic gradient, and where A is the cross-sectional area. Now we know that I equals to, that is hydraulic gradient, I equals to H by L, that is height by L. Now here you have two different pipes, right? You have two different tubes which are connected to the soil sample. Therefore, H value will become H1 minus H2. So therefore, if you substitute the value of H in Q equals to KIA condition, the value will become as Q equals to K into H. I is nothing but H by L. H value is nothing but H1 minus H2 divided by L, where L is the length of the soil sample multiplied by area of the soil sample. And that is how he had derived the relation between the discharge and the velocity of flow, which is given as Q equals to KIA. So the discharge can be found out by using the relation in terms of coefficient of permeability, hydraulic gradient, and upon knowing the cross-sectional area of the soil sample. Okay. Now the thing is, what is the difference between seepage velocity and discharge velocity? As you can see here, seepage velocity is a type of velocity where the actual fluid velocity will be there around the soil grains. See here, the water is flowing in between the soil grains. That is called as seepage velocity. Whereas discharge velocity is nothing but it is the total amount of velocity that is flowing from one end to the other end. It is called as discharge velocity. Because of the presence of seepage velocity, the phenomena which is called as piping will occur in earth dams. So we will talk about piping phenomena in the next coming classes. But as of now, just remember that the seepage velocity will be influencing the piping phenomena in earth dams, okay, or earth retaining walls. So this is the simple difference between the seepage velocity and the discharge velocity. Seepage velocity is the actual fluid velocity around the soil grains. See, you can observe the soil which is flowing in between the soil grains. Whereas discharge velocity is nothing but it is the total amount of water that is getting flowed from the starting end to the end point of the soil sample. Okay. Now we will talk about the superficial velocity, which is called or which is defined as the actual velocity of flow through soil. Right. So in the next class we will talk about the validity of Darcy's law and what are its limitations. Thank you.